We can start. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Helen Palmer. I'm a senior scientist at ATTP at Technical University of Vienna with Vera Bullman. And I'm moderating today's talk, which is with Nina Power. So I'll just quickly say something about the School for Materialist Research. And this is an education and research collective that offers intensive study courses, seminars, special programs, and research initiatives that address the materialisms running through contemporary science, philosophy, art, mathematics, design, architecture, and politics. It was founded by the Center for Philosophical Technologies at Arizona State University, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities Skopje, the Department for Architecture Theory and Philosophy of Technics at TU Vienna, and the Critical Inquiry Lab at the Design Academy Eindhoven. And it serves as a global hub for education, research, and experimentation at the intersection of the humanities, social sciences, creative fields, and the STEM sciences. And I'm very happy tonight to introduce Nina Power. Nina Power is a writer and a philosopher. She's the author of many articles, and her new book called What Do Men Want is coming out this February with Penguin. So yeah, Nina, the floor is yours.
Right. All right. Thank you for that. I'm going to read out something but it won't be for an hour. It'll be for less than an hour. And I'm actually more interested in the discussion around what we might mean by materialism and Gnosticism. And I thought particularly to discuss this in relation, well, for the school, right, the School of Materialist Research, also in a way to ask the question of what they mean by materialism as well. And so that's kind of a big part of what's going on. I think my interest in Gnosticism is spurred by recognizing, or I don't know, noticing certain tendencies in contemporary thought, which I'll try to explain or explicate via a discussion of Bataille, Couliano, and Hans Jonas in particular. So it's by no means a kind of finished article, but rather a series of potentially of provocations and suggestions to do with how we might try to think materialism and Gnosticism together, and why this might be an interesting thing to do. But I'm totally open to any kind of comment or question, and I think that is where we should head towards. But I'll read out what I have. Okay, so perhaps this is a paper about a crisis in what we mean by materialism, as well as Gnosticism. Before I discuss Gnosticism and the relation between the two, I want to ask, because this is the place to ask at the School of Materialist Research, what is currently at stake in any useful contemporary definition of materialism? And I suppose I mean that philosophically, politically, in relation to discussions of science and the kind of, I guess, the dominant narrative, maybe around that might be regarded as a form of scientism, which has come to kind of be fused with a certain kind of politics, whether materialism, critically understood, can form a kind of opposition actually to some of the idiocies of our current moment. As with Gnosticism, materialism enters into relation with science, politics, religion, art, and so on. I will, in a way, be mostly concerned, although kind of obliquely, with the second of these, which is politics. But not only, because I think any materialist politics, whether Marxist or otherwise, necessarily implies or entails a set of metaphysical assumptions that determine what we might mean today by, for example, historical materialism, dialectical materialism, eliminative materialism on the more kind of quasi-scientific end, materialist feminism, or even the more everyday use of materialism to mean something like a preoccupation with stuff or a materialist culture which prioritizes the worldly. We are, I suppose, philosophically used to thinking of materialism as the opposite of idealism, But we can, of course, oppose materialism to something like spiritualism, as Lamartine does in Man and Machine from 1747, or perhaps to something like the religious worldview, which also introduces questions of transcendence and that which may or may not exist beyond matter. So I'm going to begin with a discussion of Bataille as one of the main, if not only, thinkers to shove materialism and Gnosticism together in his short text, Base Materialism, Gnosticism from 1930. This is an attempt, as Benjamin Noyes puts it in an excellent essay on Bataille's Base Materialism, to quote, this is a quote from Noyes, to present a revision of all existing materialism. So Bataille begins this text in the following way. This is quite a long quote. If one thinks of a particular object, it is easy to distinguish matter from form, and an analogous distinction can be made with regard to organic beings, with form taking on the value of the unity of being and of its individual existence. But if things as a whole are taken into account, oh shit, sorry, someone's at the door. Oh, it's okay, someone else starts ringing. That might actually be my book arriving, hilariously. I haven't seen a copy yet, but everyone else has, right? Where am I? Okay. But if things as a whole are taken into account, transposed distinctions of this kind become arbitrary and even unintelligible. Two verbal entities are thus formed. This is the important point for my paper. Explicable only through their constructive value in the social order. An abstract God, or simply the idea, and abstract matter. The chief guard and the prison walls. The variants of this metaphysical scaffolding are of no more interest than are the different styles of architecture. People become excited trying to know if the prison came from the guard or if the guard came from the prison. And I think this is somewhat where we find ourselves in relation to thinking about Gnosticism as a form of dualism and contemporary politics. But I'll try to explain this a bit better. So Bataille points out that dialectical materialism, which he suggests has escaped systemic abstraction, has nevertheless, and notably, its starting point in Hegelian absolute idealism in this kind of like Ouroboros way, so that the only form of useful materialism from Bataille's point of view is predicated on a kind of absolute idealism. This isn't necessarily a problem, we might say. Elsewhere during this period, he writes more clearly, most materialists, even though they may have wanted to do away with all spiritual entities, ended up positing an order of things whose hierarchical relations mark it as specifically idealist. That's in the short text, materialism. So there's a kind of constitutive tendency or temptation always to reintroduce on another level that which is taken out at another one. So in a way, to try to go as Bataille does through the base, through the kind of the low, is an attempt to, if you like, at least maybe point to this structural tendency in human thought, whether it's philosophical or religious or political, which always, if you like, turns into or is predicated obliquely on its opposite. As Benjamin Noyes points out, the logic of base materialism is that whatever is elevated or ideal is actually dependent on base matter, and that this dependence means that the purity of the ideal is contaminated. So nothing is separable or pure in this way. The dependence of the ideal or elevated, the high on base matter, the low, and the contamination this produces is systematically denied by the ideal, which splits off base matter as whatever is disgusting, vile, subhuman, etc. In this way, it hopes to keep base matter in its place as the base, but this splitting off can never be completely successful because base matter is at the base of the ideal and the higher values. So base matter then is a kind of permanent reminder and remainder of everything that threatens to drag down and ruin the ideal. So in this way, it's not a simple inversion, but rather the creation of something like a third term. And the question of the third will come back in the discussion of monism, dualism, and whatever else might be possible. So rather than a kind of inversion, then base matter ultimately, potentially overturns the opposition between high and low by, as Noyes puts it, accounting for the interdependence of the high and low by being what they share. Somehow this maybe tries to go beyond at least the matter of mechanical materialism, which we might regard as kind of dead matter in some ways. And the question of what is dead and alive is sort of hovering in the background here. Again, Lamartrie, the human body is a machine which winds its own springs, he says. But also base materialism is subtly different, or maybe quite different from dialectical materialism, i.e. it's not a kind of higher synthesis, even if we might want to be a bit more nuanced about what dialectical materialism is in the sense of being a synthesis. So why, we might ask, does Bataille unusually place Gnosticism next to materialism, given that the former, whatever we want to say about it, and I'll go into that in a bit, is usually associated with dualism, first and foremost, the idea of a separation between good and evil, most obviously. And materialism, we would have to say, is primarily or fundamentally monist, whether we're talking about Bataille or Spinoza or many of the other materialists. No, not always. I mean, the atomist would be an interesting case in point as a kind of dualist materialism. So why is Gnosticism interesting for Bataille? Why does he try to put them together? For Bataille, Gnosticism introduces, as he puts it, a most impure fermentation into Greco-Roman ideology. It was not revolted, he says, by the basest religious practices. And we can see mostly in kind of hermetic or obscure or secret kind of religious cults, often initiatic rituals or things that require various forms of asceticism, but also at the other end, the kind of Blakean path, the practices of excess that Bataille is permanently interested in. So there's no sense in which human religious practices can be, cleanly separated from their taboo or sacred meaning, obviously for Bataille. So Gnosticism is clearly interesting, just almost superficially for Bataille because of this heretical and base dimension. But where I think it gets really interesting is in his discussion of Gnosticism, is the implication that matter is an active principle, having, as he puts it, its own eternal autonomous existence as darkness, and darkness not only as simply the absence of light, but rather as evil as a creative action rather than the absence of good. And again, this is very close in a way to some of what William Blake will say about energy and excess. So Bataille admits that the Gnostics generally were nevertheless largely interested in seeking the good. It's just they place the good somewhere else. The good is not in this world, it's somewhere else. And the whole question of whether Gnosticism is in a way, if not compatible from the standpoint of the church, as clearly being a heresy or as a series of heresies, nevertheless, a comprehensible part of at least Christianity, in some ways, albeit a very extreme form in some cases. Because of this idea that actually what is being sought is a higher meaning through knowledge, and that actually it's not a kind of celebration of evil for its own sake, as Bataille might have preferred, but rather just placing the good in a different position. But it is in their dualism and their method, we might say, that Bataille finds a baseness that would not be reducible. Within the generalized abandonment of idealism that Bataille sees characterizes the contemporary moment, Bataille describes, quote, the attitude of those who see in their own lives an effect of the creative action of evil. He says, it is possible in all freedom to be a plaything of evil if evil itself does not have to answer before God. So after the death of God, then you have this kind of possibility for almost like an inverse Gnosticism in Bataille, which we could call base materialism. Gnosticism, he says, therefore, in conclusion, is not so different from present-day materialism. Base matter, he says, refuses to allow itself to be reduced to the great ontological machines. And I think what I wanted to defend in Bataille is what he elsewhere describes as heterogeneous, and in the essay on fascism in particular. But I think one of the pressing problems and questions we have today, not only in any discussion of materialism, but also politically, is how to escape or evade homogeneity, the great sort of algorithmization of existence, questions of conformism, questions of measurement and quantification, and the way in which all human life is increasingly regulated and measured and bureaucratized in these ways. And I have elsewhere written about Agamben and biopolitics and health terrorism and all of those sorts of things. And so they're kind of obliquely here. But I think this kind of Bataille point about not being reduced to these ontological machines is actually very close to things that Agamben would say about anthropological machines, and also close to things that Ivan Illich would say about the tendency of bureaucracies to turn the best into the worst. You know, the corruption of the best is the worst, as he would say, and his recognition that all bureaucracies tend towards, well, he would be happy describing as evil. Bataille is using evil in a different way, almost in a positive way. So one of the questions I want to pose to everyone here in a way is whether we in fact live in a Gnostic age. Clearly, in some ways, we seem to live in highly dualistic times, despite the best efforts of deconstruction. And there's a whole other question, the relationship between deconstruction and Gnosticism. It'd be very interesting to think more about what Derrida's relationship to Gnosticism might be, for example. So whether it's the real or the virtual, mind or body, good and evil, or even actually some of the real content of the Gnostic heresies as determined by the church, so amongst which some heresies being the idea that matter, the universe and the body is evil, the idea that the universe is created by a demiurge, a kind of lesser or evil god, the idea that our souls are trapped in our bodies, the idea of a kind of fundamental fallenness, which we can also see in Plato, in that sense that there's a kind of spirit which is kind of being held back by matter. We can also include, even more specifically, veganism. Docetism is a Gnostic heresy, anti-marriage and anti-natalism, encratism, these are all Gnostic heresies, hatred of the body, body modification, or even the self-castration of the Skopsi sect. These are all Gnostic tendencies that persist in one form or another, although they're not usually described as Gnostic heresies. Everybody wants to be saved. Everybody wants to get out of their mind or their body. Everybody wants to get off the planet, and so on. But in the absence of a central religious authority determining what is a heresy and what isn't, we might wonder whether, in fact, that which was formerly kept at arm's length, because directly challenging to doctrine, and maybe one of my implicit questions is why was anti-natalism a heresy for the Catholic Church? I mean, why did they always want there to be more and more Christians? Perhaps it's a very, very stupid question in a certain way, but I like stupid questions sometimes. So, you know, without the kind of central authority determining what might count as a heresy, and indeed who might be punished, whether there has in fact been a movement from the periphery to the center, which is to say those things that were previously regarded as heresies have not in fact, whether they have in fact become dominant forms of ideology today. Are our leaders in fact archons, the androgynous demonic leaders of the world who prevent souls from leaving the material realm? What even counts as a heresy today? Materialism was a heresy, is a heresy in various periods, but is it now? What kind of subversive qualities does materialism have? And what else is there? So some of the Gnostic tendencies make competing ontological claims about matter. For example, as I've mentioned, that it is evil. But from the outset, we should be really cautious when ascribing too sweeping definitions to Gnosticism. There's a lot of scholarly debate about whether the term is indeed useful, how we might track the influence of various Gnostic ideas on one another, whether these things almost spontaneously emerge at different places at different times. There's often a kind of, I suppose, almost like a desire for an esoteric history where you track one weird thing from one place to another through kind of secret meetings or secret texts. But as we'll see, and I kind of more agree with Couliano, that this is perhaps better or more usefully understood as a kind of fundamental structural tendency in human thought towards dualism, rather than go down the kind of, can we find secret links between all of these different Gnostic ideas? It's something that we fundamentally tend towards, in our thinking of almost anything. So as Couliano, this great Romanian writer, very important thinker, he was born in 1950, he was murdered in 1991, it's still unsolved as a case. He noted in 1984, the term Gnosticism has become extremely bloated. And I thought this was a very funny quote. Not only Gnosis was Gnostic, but the Catholic authors were Gnostic, the Neoplatonic too. Reformation was Gnostic, communism was Gnostic, Nazism was Gnostic, liberalism, existentialism, and psychoanalysis were Gnostic too. Modern biology was Gnostic, Blake, Yeats, Kafka, Rilke, Proust, Joyce, Musil, Hesse, and Thomas Mann were Gnostic. From very authoritative interpreters of Gnosis, I learned further that science is Gnostic and superstition is Gnostic, power, counterpower, and lack of power are Gnostic. Left is Gnostic and right is Gnostic. Hegel is Gnostic and Marx is Gnostic. Freud is Gnostic and Jung is Gnostic. All things and their opposite are equally Gnostic. So I think there is this kind of, and I have definitely fallen into this, on occasion, imagining that everything is Gnostic in this way. So that's again also a kind of tendency that we might want to avoid. As other kind of scholarly writers who work on Gnosticism have noted, in particular, Michael Allen Williams, who's written a whole book called Rethinking Gnosticism, which attempts to, if you like, deflate the term in terms of its kind of usefulness or its coherence, arguing that it is not really either appropriate or useful. He says the following: definitions of Gnosticism have normally relied on a series of other qualifiers. The problem is that many of these other qualifiers amount to a string of caricatures that not only tend to be vague and somewhat indefinable themselves, but are in the first place of questionable validity as characterizations of the constructed category of sources usually called Gnostic. Thus, we are told that Gnostic demiurgical myths can be distinguished from others because Gnostics had an attitude. They had an attitude of protest or of revolt, an anti-cosmic attitude, right? So the idea of the opposition to the world as it presents itself. This attitude, he basically just says, Gnostic is whatever people think is punk at any given moment. This attitude allegedly showed up in the way Gnostics, in inverted commas, treated scripture. They are alleged to have reversed all its values, viewed the material cosmos, they supposedly rejected it, took an interest in society at large, they didn't, we are told, felt about their own bodies, they hated them. These revolutionaries are supposed to have lacked any serious ethical concern and to have been driven instead by their attitude towards their cosmic environment to one of two characteristically Gnostic forms of behavior: fanatical ascetic renunciation of sex and other bodily comforts and pleasures, or the exact opposite, which is again what Bataille says, unbridled debauchery and law-breaking. Gnostics, it is asserted, had no worries about their own ultimate salvation, since they understood themselves to be automatically saved because of their inner divine nature, with salvation predetermined. Ethics were irrelevant to them. So we can see in a sense that the tendency is to ascribe Gnosticism to anything that in a way represents an extreme, whether it's an extreme form of asceticism or an extreme form of anti-asceticism. So part of the widespread use of Gnosticism, particularly in any discussion of politics, must lie at the feet of Voegelin, who in The New Science of Politics in 1952 makes his famous argument that in essence, all modern politics is Gnostic in tendency, in that it seeks, left or right, to immanentize the eschaton. And see Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shear's Illuminatis trilogy for more on this idea. So to immanentize the eschaton is in essence to bring about heaven on earth, the idea that you through politics can sort of accelerate the apocalypse. And this doesn't have to be religious, but it's religious in form, but it might not be religious in content. So something like communism would obviously be in many ways opposed to Christianity, but is nevertheless guided by this desire to bring about a kind of utopia or eschaton or apocalyptic scene on earth. So we can also maybe ask whether accelerationism falls into this, whether wokeness, so-called wokeness, falls into the trap of Vogelin's description of Gnostic tendency. I wonder about neo-iconoclasm, whether this sort of desire to remove the symbols and signs of bad history and bad men and bad things that bad people did in bad history is an attempt actually to kind of inaugurate a kind of heaven on earth, or at least a sort of post-bad situation. We can also think about artificial intelligence as a potential alien god, as something to come from the outside, or as a consequence of the singularity or technology that will somehow transform all life as we come to understand it. But let us remember that Hans Jonas in 1958 in the Gnostic religion already notes that, quote, "In the name of the great first alien life from the worlds of light, the sublime that stands above all works," he says, "this is the standard opening of Mandean compositions, and that alien is a constant attribute of the life that by its nature is alien to this world, and under certain conditions alien within it." So Jonas attempts to say that contemporary existentialism is a continuation of Gnosticism in many ways, and this form of feeling of alienation or nausea, as Sartre would describe it, is a kind of Gnostic insight. So what Gnosticism and existentialism question, you could say, is the criterion or the valuation of ecosystemic intelligence. So the degree to which the universe can be attributed to an intelligent and good cause. So the idea that if the demiurge is evil or stupid, that God or the creator is not all-knowing and certainly not all good. And the anthropic principle. So the idea that there is a commensurability and a mutual link or a compatibility between human beings and the universe. And obviously this would go down the route of natural law and the idea that there is some kind of harmony between humanity and God's creation. And of course, we are part of God's creation in that model. So both of these assumptions, right? So the idea that that the universe is intelligent and can be understood, is and the idea that there is a kind of necessary and positive link between humanity and the universe is questioned by Gnosticism. Nevertheless, Couliano will say that ultimately, unlike existentialism, Gnosticism is fundamentally optimistic on the cosmic level. Human beings indeed belong to a higher and better world than this one, and that the process of gnosis, of understanding or knowledge, is a way of reaching this. So even though the Gnostic starting point, it seems very bleak, that matter is evil, that we're in a universe created by a stupid blind god or something like this, but nevertheless ultimately it's a kind of positive model, and this is what Bataille also notices, although of course he wants to keep the base aspect. So existentialism then ends up being perhaps more pessimistic in the sense that there's no possibility of recourse to transcendence of any kind. It's not like, although you have to create your own meaning, it's not a kind of upbuilding story in the existentialist narrative. It's not that kind of esoteric, initiatic, ladder climbing model. So even though Sartre and de Beauvoir contest the idea that existentialism is pessimistic, I think nonetheless, compared to Gnosticism, even though it has similar starting points, it's not nearly as optimistic at the cosmic level. So back to Voegelin and this kind of question about Gnosticism and politics. So this is quite a famous quote from Voegelin from The New Science of Politics, but I just wanted to read it just to remind people. So he says, the soteriological truth, i.e. that which relates to salvation of Christianity, breaks with the rhythm of existence. Beyond temporal successes and reverses lies the supernatural destiny of man, the perfection through grace in the beyond. Man and mankind now have fulfillment, but it lies beyond nature. I think that's an important line. Again, there is no eidos form, a form of history. This is important, I think, when we're dealing with claims to be on the right side of history, which are very prevalent today. I think Voegelin reminds us that there is no form of history. As he says, the eschatological supernature is not a nature in the philosophical immanent sense. The problem of an eidos in history, hence, arises only when Christian transcendental fulfillment becomes immanentized, right? So that this is not about what is to come, which in any case you must passively wait for. God moves in mysterious ways. We don't know how things function, but rather the attempt to kind of bring it on, basically, which Voegelin thinks characterizes the West and Western politics of all kinds. Voegelin says, such an immanentist hypothesis of the eschaton, however, is a typical fallacy. Things are not things, nor do they have essences by arbitrary declaration. The course of history as a whole is no object of experience. History has no eidos because the course of history extends into the unknown future. The meaning of history, thus, is an illusion. And this illusory eidos is created by treating a symbol of faith as if it were a proposition concerning an object of imminent experience. And I think there's something maybe interesting to be asked about the contemporary mood or mode of politics and what it means to feel like one is doing politics. I think a lot of the time we veer between feeling, sorry, my camera's gone out of focus, veer between thinking that we are somehow completely alienated from politics as such, or that there's a kind of sense of urgency and that everything must be solved all at once. And I think there's a kind of pendulum swing that often we even might personally experience about how to cope with, what would otherwise would have been called evil and is now called, I don't know, all that is wrong in the world. So while we might blame Voegelin for what has become the kind of overuse of Gnosticism as a descriptive term in political discourse, we also have to say that his insight perhaps provides a useful prism with which to understand some of the contemporary tendencies, the kind of urgency, the desire to bring about radical change in the present, and so on. I also just wanted to briefly mention the way in which the Catholic Church continues to use Gnosticism as a critique of the modern world. So in November last year, a Catholic priest called Jose Gomez described what he called the woke message as comprised of ideas that, quote, are very similar to heresies and false gospels that we find throughout the history of the church. Like the Manichaeans, these movements see the world as a struggle between good and evil, the just versus the unjust. And as Gnostics reject creation and the body, believing that human beings can make themselves whatever they want, these movements are also Pelagian, since they believe that redemption can be achieved through our own human effort without having divine grace. In the end, these movements are utopian, he says, because they seem to believe that we can create a kind of heaven on earth, a perfect society through political power. So even though the church is not the church as it was, nevertheless, the church still diagnoses various Gnostic heresies, which it, at least in the case of this priest, attaches to what we might call social justice or left liberal ideas. Again, we also see the bringing back of the use of Gnosticism, or the use of Gnosticism in writers like Mary Harrington as a sort of diagnostic. In an article entitled "Welcome to Fully Automated Luxury Gnosticism" from September last year, she writes, the Gnostic longing to become creatures of pure consciousness has gone supernova. So I think there's also whether Gnosticism is a useful heuristic for thinking about dualistic tendencies in contemporary perpetual tendencies in human thought is one thing. The other thing, I suppose, is this question of whether it's a useful diagnostic in the details of the current world. It seems very, very obvious that there is a temptation to start to talk about things like, or already talk about things like transhumanism, or AI, or I don't know, the metaverse, or even being online as such, as a kind of Gnostic, dualistic potential heresy, and the idea that the online life encourages the split between mind and body, or reinforces that split. So the question of whether the world is Gnostic, or whether there are things in the world that are Gnostic, or whether Gnosticism is a useful diagnostic, or a palimpsest that we can take from the religious discussion, I'm going to leave as an open question. But I want to say, to maybe finish a little bit on this last suggestion. What if we saw in Gnosticism not a history of scattered and hard to pin down sects, but rather a powerful structural tendency in thought, which is potentially ineradicable, I think, as an attempt to solve various problems. So dualism, in the first place, and Couliano suggests this as well, is essentially a very simple solution devised by the human mind to account for the manifest flaws of existence. He says people did not wait for the invention of writing to express it. It occurs in most regions of the world in myths recorded by anthropologists. And he gives, as an example, a very common myth, which you find all over the place. So one story, a character more often male than female, who may be co-eternal with the primordial being or born later, sometimes from the primordial being himself, spoils creation as a result of his clumsiness, or more often of his irresistible urge to play tricks. So the Gnostic idea of the demiurge or the trickster is a kind of a fundamental solution, if you like, to the problem of evil, or just the fact that things don't work, that the world is not perfect in a certain way. So for Couliano, then, dualism is ultimately comprehensible as a logical structural feature of the human mind, which raises the question, I think, of how or whether we should keep dualism in check, or whether it's possible to even do so. And obviously the church is still trying to stamp out these heresies. So obviously there are some solutions. There's a solution in the three, whether we're talking about Hegelianism, dialectics, deconstruction, or in the multiple, Deleuzean multiplicity. We can also note St. Augustine's turn against Manichaeanism in the Confessions, the idea that the world is divided into kind of good and evil. He presents a very interesting description of his own turn away from that position. Or even something like Wittgenstein's dissolution of philosophical problems. One way then of thinking, understanding philosophy as a whole is as a kind of war on dualism in certain ways, even though there are dualisms in philosophy as well. We can think about materialist monism, whether we're talking about one thing or one thing as an infinite thing, so Spinoza's substance. So the solution of the two, which is a solution to a real problem, does seem to lead us into difficult places. Whether it's the desire to divide the world into good and bad people, or to see everyone in black and white ways, or almost to sort of code the world in terms of whether things are good or bad. I think it always seems to come back. It's a very difficult urge to keep in check. And also I was trying to think about Schmitt and the friend-enemy distinction, whether that's a form of kind of Gnostic dualism. We always have the kind of the sort of temptation and the difficulties of dualism, I suppose, as a structure of thought. And whether we want to call that Gnostic or not is another question. So three things as a solution seems to be kind of cool. some of the time, whether we're talking about Hegel or the Christian Trinity. And remember what Hegel says about Islam. The problem with Islam is it's too direct. The idea that you are in direct communion with Allah leads to fanaticism for Hegel. You need the Trinity as a form of mediation between you and God. The solution, the multiple solution, the idea that things are both one and multiple at the same time, I think always runs the risk of folding back into a kind of indeterminacy, what Hegel would describe as the night in which all cows are black. And so I don't know, it's a kind of open question, and maybe it's a kind of numerical question, you know, that if we reduce it down to questions of numbers, you know, that is the solution one thing, two things, three things, multiple things, infinite things, or sets of infinite things, as Bataille would have it. You know, Bataille's proposition that in a way mathematics solves the mathematics is the domain of ontology, that philosophy doesn't need to bother with it anymore because maths is better, set theory and category theory are better at understanding or at least formalizing the different kinds of infinity. So anyway, it's a kind of question about how to number thought, or the numbering of thought, as it were. Couliano ultimately ties Gnosticism in the end of his book called The Tree of Gnosis to modern nihilism. He says, from a systemic viewpoint, the game of modern nihilism starts from a rule that is the extreme opposite of the rule that produces dualistic scenarios, but it reaches conclusions that are formally identical insofar as it recognizes the need to annihilate the current Christian concept of value. So in this sense, Nietzsche's diagnostic of European nihilism, the fact that nihilism is in a way the kind of the dominant mode, is a form of Gnosticism without salvation, I suppose. The idea that we are fallen, that we are alienated, that we are that matter is evil, that the body is a problem, and so on. And that but for modern nihilism, there's no way out of that. There's no kind of esoteric initiatic pathway out of that. There's no knowledge as such. There's just a series of perhaps increasing confusions where we attempt to determine meaning. So ultimately, Couliano, in this very structuralist account of Gnosticism, I think, basically describes the structural tendency towards dualism as a kind of logical set of choices. He says there's either one principle or two principles. Either the evil derives from good, and then good is not so good, and evil is not so evil, which would be the sort of yin-yang solution, or else evil and good are separated. Evil is genuinely evil and good is genuinely good. Couliano notes, it seems astonishing that so much blood was shed for so little. But I think if we see human history as the bouncing between, amongst other things, dualism and monism, if not materialism and idealism, then there is no reason why anything has logically shifted today, unless we think we're beyond these tendencies, which I don't think we are. So I want to leave on a sort of question, really, which is where to locate the dualistic tendency today, and is there any sort of I don't want to say salvation, is there any hope or resources in a kind of materialism, whether it's a Bataillean based materialism? And again, the problem of how Bataille's pathways through matter themselves are perhaps in a way no longer subversive as in the way that they might have been when he was describing them. But so I want to basically say in conclusion, a very loose conclusion, that something about the heterogeneous, as Bataille describes it, so that which in a way cannot be reduced to any pre-existing system, and that politics in that sense is a kind of is problematic when it attempts to sort of codify or systematize the heterogeneous. So if the heterogeneous is not necessarily dualistic, and it's not necessarily Gnostic either, if we want to say that Gnosticism is something logically or structurally like the tendency or the temptation towards dualism, which is what Couliano ultimately argues. So the sort of defense of the heterogeneous as that which can't be kind of sort of captured or made homogeneous by definition. Where does that lie in relation to this discussion of the numbering of things, I suppose? I'll leave it there, but we can talk about any of this. I'm getting really hot, by the way, because I turned my radiator on to like 40 degrees, but it's fine. I don't know why. It's just really cold. Okay.
Thank you, Nina. I am sure we will have a lot of questions.
I'm going to turn the radiator off.
Okay, we have one from Dr. Martin Rosenberg. Yeah, feel free. If you, I don't know if I have the power to unmute people. Give me 1 second.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Nina, it's great to finally meet you. I'm a fan. I'm looking forward to your book. I have a comment, because this is a topic of real interest to me, which is a materialist understanding of immanence and immanence's relationship to irreversibility and emergence. And I'm looking specifically at the origins of the work of Ilya Prigogine from his dissertation during World War II, back through the monism, if you could say that, of Spinoza, and particularly of Spinoza's relationship to the Kabbalist Isaac Luria. And the reason why I mention Isaac Luria is that I've been exploring the relationship between irreversibility, immanence, and emergence in Luria, and seeing in Luria the origins of what's known in Jewish theology as tikkun olam.
Yeah,
is the universal tendency towards movement toward perfection, irrespective of whether we ever arrive there, and that we are all, in a sense, committed instinctually to that project. And I'm wondering, so this connection between Gnosticism, which one could suggest that Prigogine represents that tradition within the field of physics, because he's insisting on process rather than states, with reference to these three concepts that I mentioned, and the people that are connected to Prigogine, Bergson, for example, his sister was married to Mather, who translated in part the very Portuguese translation of Isaac Luria that Spinoza read in Amsterdam. So there are lots and lots of other connections. So when we talk about Gnosticism, I guess what I've done is, and to talk about Gnosticism and materialism, is I've looked at the work of Prigogine as a physicist and tried to come up with an ontotheology of a materialist perspective on these three concepts: irreversibility, immanence, and emergence. And so anchoring them in a specific thread of Gnosticism, which is Kabbalism, provides a way to solidify these mobile relations, which enable us to do this kind of critique. And so I'm completely empathetic to the project here. I think it's really important, and in particular, the connection between materialism and politics in precisely this way, and in precisely the way that people have attributed, for example, the work of Isaac Luria to a sense of immanent politics.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to ask you more about what you mean by irreversibility. It does make me wonder whether the Gustave Noé film is Gnostic, which it might be. I'm sure he knows all about it. But yes, I mean, I've read Prigogine, but not for a long time. I mean, I think that I didn't really want to or have time to go into philosophy of science or you know, the question of Gnosticism and science, which would or materialism and science. And I think sometimes, I don't know, maybe sometimes we regard philosophical materialism, unless it's at the hard end, like eliminative materialism, as kind of science for philosophers. But I actually want to say that there's more to it in that. And I think particularly in the last couple of years, where we've seen a kind of discourse on science, or a kind of a very dominant image of science kind of take over people's brains in a very negative way, that almost any other philosophy of science would be useful, right? Like at this point, I think any other ways of thinking about what's actually happening, even before we get to the politicization of science, would be of great service to humanity. So
if I could just interrupt, one source for me has been the work of Isabel Stengers, whose book on cosmopolitics points to the fact that Prigogine was really at the most fundamental level attacking the grounds of Western mathematics, and in particularly this shift from states to processes requires a completely new kind of mathematics. Bergson prophesies the need for a new mathematics precisely on these terms. And I see Prigogine is really, empirical project is really an attempt to exfoliate what Bergson meant at that particular. And the one thing I would mention is that I believe that both Bergson and Prigogine see this as materialist and not idealist.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think on the other point, which I you know, obviously you're linking together, but the question of the sort of Kabbalistic, Gnostic aspect. I mean, it's interesting in the Couliano book, The Tree of Gnosis, he says at the end that basically Harold Bloom is probably the only living Gnostic. R.I.P. Harold Bloom. But you know, obviously there is a kind of dimension of his work which is kind of constantly exploring what you mentioned in terms of like tikkun alum and the idea of the broken pots, and you know, there is the kind of the Kabbalistic Gnostic aspect, which Gershom Scholem also talks about.
I would point out that we're talking about Gershom Scholem rather than, for example, Madonna. Okay, let's make.
Oh no, sure. I mean, it's you know, and I think I suppose the Couliano structuralist approach is in a way to say, well, it's almost like saying it's not surprising that you have not what we could call Gnostic, although that's a, you know, perhaps not the most useful way of describing it, but let's say there are always going to be dualistic tendencies in every major religion, right? So I mean, whether we want to talk about the kind of, you know, Kabbalah as the esoteric aspect of Judaism, or Sufism as the esoteric aspect of Islam, or you know, the various Christian heresies and sects as the esoteric aspect of Christianity, like the, you know, the very idea of the esoteric in a way. One of the implications is that there are forms of initiation and understanding which are not neither comprehensible by everyone, nor are they communicable through mainstream religious channels, right? So that that's why the idea of like the hidden forms of gnosis would also stress the idea of experience, which is another reason why Bataille would obviously think that the Gnostics are interesting, because the forms of knowledge that you gain from experience, and again, even to talk in this language is to undermine, if you like, the, I don't know, even the mystical or spiritual transformative aspects. So yes, I mean, I'd be very interested to see a project that kind of linked, you know, Kabbalistic thought to a kind of processual monist or materialist philosophy of science, you know.
Thank you, Nina. Great talk. Really.
Okay. Anyone else have a question? John Appleby.
Sorry, I'm useless for these things.
Hello, John.
Hi, yeah, you're right.
Good.
I got two questions which are kind of joined together. I mean, one of the big criticisms, or more recent criticism of materialism, is it's ended up so broad and so wide that it doesn't actually explain anything. And I wonder if there's a danger with what you're doing with Gnosticism, where Gnosticism is going to end up in the same way. You know, everything's Gnostic, so, you know, so what? The other thing is, as you say, I mean, there's a lot of different forms in Gnosticism, but I mean, a key thing to an awful lot of them, which you sort of said about the Bataille quote, is, you know, good is not in this world. And from a political point of view, I mean, what worries me about this is basically that, you know, you're talking about pointing at something completely external to experience on some sort of mystical level in order to actually effect any form of useful political change. I mean, A, is that possible? And B, is it even desirable?
Yeah. So on the first point, the kind of broad question, I mean, I tried to keep up with the sort of discussions in contemporary philosophical materialism. I went back and looked at the volume, What is Materialism, from Plea, from all those years ago, 2001, it's over 20 years old. Yes, and I mean, I don't disagree. I suppose, I don't know. I mean, it strikes me, I mean, maybe this is an unfair thing to say, but even people who would regard themselves as historical or dialectical materialists are not particularly saying anything very insightful about the current political situation, whether they are speaking from inside the academy or outside of it. And I wonder if there's a kind of lack of diagnostic capacity there. I mean, this culminates, I think, in the this sort of endless and stupid discussion about class reductionism, you know, which often happens, I think. But I think also as well in terms of how we understand history in a materialist way, you know, and in terms of forces of exploitation and oppression and who's being oppressed, why and how and where, all seem to have been evacuated of any materialist content in recent years. And I wonder if there's a kind of systematic virtualization of thought which is going on, which I suppose is why people reach for Gnosticism as a description. I mean, I totally agree that the you know, as in why I read those quotes about Gnosticism also being kind of too broad, like that's also one of the problems. Like you can see it everywhere if you want, you know, that's what Couliano makes the joke, like it's in all these people, it's in all these things, it's in left politics, right politics, you know, and that's kind of what Berglin suggests, you know, that's his positive analysis in a way. Well, he thinks it's bad, but you know what I mean. He sees that this desire to immanentize the eschaton is the tendency of all Western liberal politics, and which does pose the question of whether there is any value in politics at all. You know, I mean, why in a sense bother doing any of this, right? Like if actually all you're going to do is bring about something horrible, you know, you think you're bringing about utopia, but in fact you're, you know, just hastening destruction, you know, and they're kind of two sides of the same coin. And I mean, somebody like Gwenon and the perennialists would say that actually, you know, this is just the tendency of the West as such, is towards action, whether it's good or not. Like that this is, you know, it's not a contemplative passive position in relation to existence, it's just doing something. And whether you dignify that with the word politics or not is another question. And it is interesting if you think about what has also been lost in a secular age. You know, obviously there are still churches and so on, people still believe, but let's say, you know, we accept some of Nietzsche's diagnosis. Some of the things that have been lost are things like the contemplative, I don't know, forgiveness, passivity, the acceptance that we're all broken and we all make mistakes, you know, in favor of a kind of like often very sort of almost unlivably difficult set of moral standards, which nobody knows what they actually are, but everyone's very anxious all the time, you know. So because I think Christianity, I mean, you know, someone like Girard is obviously really important in all this, like in terms of the actual function, the social function of religion. So without the social function of religion as a kind of forgiveness mechanism, you do end up in like purity spirals and so on, some of which might superficially look similar to Gnostic tendencies, like the desire to completely abnegate the body, for example, you know, is a Gnostic tendency. There's no doubt about it. And I think there is I want to retain some use, even if it's at the level of a kind of superficial content. And it's not necessarily that people think will understand what they're doing as Gnostic, or even that it's part of a process of salvation or a desire to escape their mortal body. They might just say, well, I feel terrible, I don't like my body, right? You know, and but why don't they like their body? You know, why is there no kind of acceptance of embodiment? And we always reach not for a religious or a philosophical explanation, but for a kind of social one, which is also a bit circular. It's like, well, we live in a society that makes people feel bad about their bodies, therefore they feel bad about their bodies, right? Or like beauty standards are too high or whatever. You know, there's lots of kind of social explanations, but not very many philosophical explanations, I think, or not enough. So your second point was about a kind of anti-politics, and I suppose I already kind of covered that in a way. I suppose, you know, I mean, a properly Gnostic politics would be anti-politics. It would be, you know, I think turning away from what gets described as politics in a certain sense, because that level, that especially like the discourse, or especially like politics on the news, is a kind of it's just more of the same. It's just confirmation that things are kind of evil and banal, and that we're led by sort of monsters. And I mean, it's hard to deny that in some ways. Yeah, but I mean, I take your point. I must admit, I don't know what people mean when they talk about materialism today. Like, this is part of my kind of problem or question, really. And I'd kind of be interested to know what people think, you know, whether they still think it's useful, or whether we're in a sort of post-materialist age conceptually.
Okay, I'm just going to read a question from the chat, from Tom's iPad. Tom is here, I think. So Tom's iPad asks, is initiation still possible or even desirable in the contemporary world? The ancient world has a specific kind of visceral pathos that the Gnostics sought to escape in the desert. So does that pathos still exist, and do we need to escape?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's interesting to think about the ways in which people maybe like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, we're often talking about exodus or exit as a political strategy. Everyone from like Hart and Negri or Viano, or the kind of Italian post-autonomous left. And I think, you know, or Nick Land's idea of the outside. I think there is still this kind of desire to kind of, to exit or escape, or, I don't know, reach sort of terminal velocity, or and that's kind of one route out. Like, everyone wants to get, you know, as I said, out of their mind or out of their body. And we can see that it's in the techno-futurist fantasies of, you know, immortality and uploading your mind to the cloud, and all of these sorts of things, which are just, you know, updated versions of classical myths and perennial fantasies that human beings have. So I think I don't know. I mean, initiation implies, again, a sort of esoteric hidden dimension, right? The initiate, like if you think about, I don't know, the Mithraic soldier cult and the forms of initiation that were involved in that kind of secret cult, you know, it was very, very popular during Roman times. And I don't know, I mean, whether people understand various practices as ritualistic or not, I suppose, is one of the questions. I mean, Bataille obviously seeks to, you know, make certain taboo practices in a way function in terms of their sacred quality as forms of excess and as forms of disruption and heterogeneity, whether it's laughter or crying or you know, awful sex or whatever, you know, or the kind of terrible feelings of shame and guilt, and you know, to think of those as initiatic in some way. So I think I mean Bataille is one of the last great thinkers I think of initiatic life, and so yeah, I don't know. I think probably one of the things about initiation is it's also self guided. It's not something that you can sort of I don't know, be told in a kind of general way. I'm sure that our elites engage in forms of ritual and initiation, and I think probably people should come up with their own as well. I mean, yeah.
Okay, Katerina, I think you were next.
Sorry, trouble unmuting myself. Hi, Nina.
Hey.
Thanks for coming over. Okay, I thought maybe I should comment or in a way respond to the to some of the questions you raised, because I took them as directed to the school as well. What do we understand under the materialism? What forms of materialism do we embrace? I must say we don't have, I'm sorry, just a second, I have to deal with a very naughty puppy here. Max, sit. Okay, sorry. Trouble in the animal kingdom. Okay, I'll respond now. So I must say we do not have a consensus as to what materialism is. I mean, the founding members, let's say the 4 directors that founded the platform have come from different background. Mine is mainly indebted to Marx, as you might have guessed, and Laruelle to some extent, even though we cannot call Laruelle a Marxist, but I, let's say, still use a lot of his methodology in approaching, yeah, you heard the dog, in approaching Marx and the way I treat Marx. But then Vera Bullman and her school at Vienna have a completely different set of issues they address, and the fields of mathematics primarily and logic. Trying to unravel idealist versus materialist strands there. Then we have it's not part of the platform, but it's somehow indirectly linked to it, a book project that 2 of the regular speakers at the platform and one who appeared just once, so 3 authors, myself, Paul Cockshut and Greg Michelson. We're working on a book on materialism, which is inspired by Marx, which kind of tries to anchor Marx and Marxian materialism, Marxist materialism, and reinvent some sort of Marxism in terms of the original Marxist, what we consider original Marxist stance toward materialism, which is indebted to Greek atomism. So we use, let's say, this hermeneutical apparatus or set of tools developed into an apparatus to study materialisms and idealisms within sciences as well. So it's not like we are departing from the presupposition that sciences are indisputably materialist as opposed to philosophy. So we study these opposing lines of thought within the sciences and scientific models of interpretation, mathematics, physics, biology, chemistry, etc. I mean, I'm dealing with philosophy proper and classics there. There's the scientists, they're dealing with the science there. So then Arizona, they are mainly interested in it will be a simplification, but it's a predominant interest, let's say, of Adam Nocek, this critical animal studies. So then we have the Utrecht school through Iris van der Thuyen, so feminist materialisms, and the new materialism, again, linked to the Utrecht school. So these are, let's say, the starting positions, but we open the floor to many other variants of materialisms that have been presented here, including, let's say, materialist mysticism, shall we call it? Yeah, Bergsonism. John Ilmalarka talked about it. So, you know, it's an open-ended discussion. So we don't have a consensus or, you know, a final word as to what materialism is. What brings us all together is perhaps this fatigue with the dominance of the post-structuralist paradigm. Maybe that's, we are very heterogeneous, but maybe that's the thing we all have in common. Now I'm daring speaking on behalf of everyone, but this is my impression of what we are.
Yeah, I think you're allowed. Yeah, it's interesting sort of thinking about this talk, and particularly in relation to deconstruction and Derrida in particular. And I don't know whether you know, when you say this response to post-structuralism, I did kind of wonder, as I briefly mentioned, like whether, in a sense, deconstruction was part of an attempt to ward off the problems of dualism, you know, that actually was, yeah, like that, you know, and I think it's obvious, right? I think
yeah, I agree.
What is happening there? But I think, you know, what are the contemporary solutions, let's say, to the problem of the tendency of binarism or dualism as a mechanism of thought that then has social and political implications? I don't think the contemporary solutions are very good. I think they're very, very dangerous and very bad. I don't think you can dissolve binaries that easily. And I wonder if I don't know how to put it, that at least what Derrida and others were trying to do, and maybe Catherine Malabou also to some extent, is trying to actually present a more, I almost want to say, playful way of learning to live with this tendency towards dualism and binarism, which obviously has its material basis. You know, in the nature of the sexes would be the most obvious one, and we can see that the way in which sexual difference is being absolutely, you know, become verboten as a way of thinking in many ways in the kind of current sort of liberal ideology. You know, so I kind of almost maybe ultimately what I want to do is defend the post-structuralist playfulness in relation to the ineradicability of the binary, which is terrible, isn't it? So I'm definitely not ever going to join your school, I'm afraid, even though I have great respect for it.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thanks.
Well, you know what I mean.
We did have a talk on Derrida recently.
I know. I'm not saying.
Yeah.
No, I'm just being kind of almost silly in a way, but I wonder if, you know, because this is also my question, like what becomes a heresy? Like what is perceived to be a heresy, of course, depends upon who is determining what is more extreme and what is acceptable. You know, so from the Catholic Church's point of view, it's not acceptable not to, this is in the Bible, in the New Testament, you know, when I think they write a letter to one of the priests and they say, look, you've got to stop people not eating meat, right? People have to eat meat. They have to get married and they have to have children. Like, you know, so, but when you don't have a central authority, like we have an acephallic set of ideological tenets that seem to be free floating, but infinitely repeated, right? There is no recognizable central authority. But do we still have heresies, and in what sense, and what are the heresies today? And I think they change all the time. And I think to be aware of what is the periphery and what is the, you know, and how the periphery moves to the center is kind of crucial. Yeah, no, but obviously I have intense respect for you and the school.
Thanks. I know. Thanks. Okay, let's give the floor to the others.
Okay. Toshia, you were next.
Hello, thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. I really enjoyed. When I read Bataille's the base materialism and gnosis, I'm always thinking how to reconcile, or is it possible to reconcile materialism and spiritualism, or materialism and mysticism. So I think I can draw one more adjunct line for thinking about it. Yes, Laruelle. Laruelle's non-philosophical system and his non-philosophy is always related to the gnosis. But at the same time, it's defined as science and also as mysticism in certain sense. And obviously, he was inspired by some lineage of the Islamic studies, Henri Corbin, some Ishmael sect, especially in terms of the idea of the struggle, rebel, insurrection, riot, and so on. Rather than ideological political revolution, Laruelle was thinking about more revolt, insurrection, and a rebel. And in that context, he was thinking about hidden imam in an Islamic context, unlike Messiah in Catholicism or Christianity. Yes, my question is so simple. In the future, near future, is it possible to combine Bataille's the base materialism and understanding of gnosis can connect or crisscross with some argument and some points in Laruelle. Obviously, some parts of the nouveau philosophe, like Guy Lardoureau or Christian Jambert, they are also Maoist, but at the same time, they are deeply interested in gnosis. Laruelle also grasped this context. Yes, that is a half remark and a half question. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. I can't really speak too much on Laruelle, but I think this idea of perhaps the non-opposition between materialism and spiritualism, or at least an attempt to not necessarily oppose them, which is what we would generally do in the kind of dialectical materialist tradition, or, in a Marxist materialist way, or the ancient atomists would provide the model, if you like, for a kind of potentially completely non-transcendent, non-religious description of the world, that everything is atoms and void, and you shove in chance with the Klineman, with Epicurus, but you kind of solve the problem of at least of a description at a certain level. I think one of the things that your question or comment raises is that actually the question of time and temporality, and the difference between, let's say, a kind of the linear concept of time, which Voegelin obviously sees in a way as the problem. Like, so when you try to bring about the end, whether it's Christian, post-Christian, left, right, whatever, whether it's communist and so on, that's the problem, right? Like that's the Gnostic tendency in all contemporary politics. But obviously, if you have a kind of a notion of time as kind of cyclical, or a question of reincarnation, you don't have the same political pressure. You're not trying to bring about the end, because the end is the beginning, is the end is the beginning, right? There's nothing in a way you can do. Like you can try and hasten the end, and then we could talk about nuclear war and the kind of what happens in when the possibility of destruction, total destruction of humanity is a real possibility, and how this transforms thought. But in any case, whether we think about the heat death of the universe or whatever, it absolutely changes, I think, how you understand matter, whether you think that time is linear or cyclical, right? And it's not something maybe can go into too much detail, but I think in Shia, when you mentioned the hidden Imam, or the 12th Imam, I think the idea that something will come back is subtly different in Shia Islam than the kind of, as you say, the messianic, whether someone or something is waiting, or where it's waiting, is it an imminent waiting, or is it a kind of transcendent waiting? But yeah, I'm all in favor of a kind of mystic materialism. Well, why not? I mean, the other alternatives are just so boring. I just would prefer something more interesting. So yeah.
Okay, Benjamin.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. Yeah. Thanks for the speech. That was really good. Hello, everybody. It's been a long time since I had a lecture from Nina. I was one of your students back in
I remember
2007, so it was a long time ago. I just had a question. I just finished actually R.D. Laing's The Divided Self.
Yeah.
And it just got me thinking about this kind of idea of, if we say that opposition to the world is kind of a Gnostic project, or opposition to the world as it presents itself is this kind of Gnostic project. I just started thinking, is there a way to understand or approach someone like R.D. Laing's attempt to understand human experience as a valid way to look at the world? Does that kind of cast away phenomenology? Does that make that incompatible with Gnosticism? Or is there a way to understand phenomenology as actually a Gnostic project in itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what Hans Jonas is trying to do. So, I mean, in various texts, but I mean, the one I was just looking at again was the Gnostic religion, where he basically wants to say that the kinds of, I mean, Laing would describe as, split or divided, or in the existentialist language, the idea that we are, kind of fundamentally alienated in some kind of depressing and sickening way from the universe, that we can't correspond with it. We don't have any kind of unifying type of being, that our being is fundamentally divided and split in that sense, and that consciousness after Hegel is lack, that we are constantly desiring or thinking about things that we don't have or we can't be, and that this is in a way what the human condition is. So I think R.D. Laing in that sense, would be part from a sort of, the reading that Jonas gives of a kind of neo-Gnostic tendency, and that because also in Heidegger and the kind of, I don't know, the deeper phenomenologists, that there's a kind of fundamental disconnect or divide that can be sort of overcome or understood to some degree, right? But as Couliano says, it's not as optimistic as Gnosticism, that nihilism is the kind of precondition for a certain kind of existentialist or a phenomenological understanding of the world. And again, I think the problem would be the Vogelin diagnosis, the tendency to try to solve that problem, right? So we can talk about whether Heidegger saw in Nazism a solution to the question of being, that the Nazis would somehow resurrect the Greek question, and the endless discussion about that, that in a way trying to make your philosophy of politics is not necessarily the best idea. And I mean, with R.D. Laing, actually, it's really interesting because I think a certain version of his argument and David Cooper's, particularly against the family, so their critique of the family and their sort of, especially Cooper, their kind of quite polemical desire to destroy the family, which has been taken up again, I think, by people who are much less thoughtful than Laing and Cooper, and much less interested in social relations and de-alienation, but rather they're interested in accelerating alienation. There's kind of techno left, we might call them. I think nevertheless that we can see that as a kind of Gnostic project, according to the church's criticism of those Gnostic heresies that were so ascetic that they sought to deny, you know, to become incels, to stop having sex, to stop having families, to stop reproducing, or volcels, I should say, voluntary celibates. And you know, again, these are perennial human temptations, right? To stop oneself from doing things or to do them excessively. Like, it's very hard to be moderate, I think, is the conclusion. But it's interesting. I think we probably could see, not just by reading Jonas, but you know, in other ways, that there are Gnostic tendencies in Lang and Cooper. You know, but at the same time, I think their kind of psychedelic celebration of a kind of communal intensity is also a kind of solution. You know, it's a worldly solution to alienation as well. But yeah, it's a good question.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any more questions, comments? Any more from the live stream? I'm guessing not, if there's none been put into.
No, there is nothing from the live stream.
Everyone's died. It's good. Solves the problem.
Can I? All right, I'll ask you one, Nina. Hi, Nina.
Who's that?
Charlie Blake. Hi.
Oh, hello. Sorry, I can't see your little screen. Let me find it.
Oh, it's really tiny and it's very blurry. I was just thinking about. I mean, you covered Gnosticism very well. It's such an incredibly mercurial term. In many ways, I think you suggested, it's a bit like punk or Dada. People use it to describe anything that's going to be unsettling the order.
Yeah.
In a positive way. But there's a particular strand, Valentinian Gnosticism, in which there is a kind of ontological separation between different kinds of people. The somatics, the psychical, and the pneumatics. And the idea being that the pneumatics had some element of the pleroma in them that they could nurture to escape back into the pleroma. The psychicals had a little bit, but not enough to escape, and the somatics had none at all. But this was on a kind of monistic model in which the pleroma, the realm of pure light, had an intrinsic tendency to decay into hyle, into matter. So there is a kind of monistic system which could possibly connect it with certain ideas in contemporary physics. But it's also related to a political ontology, which maybe some people would probably align themselves to. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting idea. I mean, there are still some people, well, obviously various religious movements think that there only certain people will be saved, right? That only a certain number of people will be saved. Sometimes people talk about there are not enough souls to go round. The NPC meme from a few years ago was very controversial. The idea that there are some people who simply, you know, are basically like non-player characters in a computer game, and they just repeat whatever they're told. And, you know, I don't know, like ideas of like sheeple or whatever. So, I mean, there's always a tendency, I think, to divide people into like those who are saved and those who are not. And obviously we can look at the, you know, Weber's analysis of the, you know, the Calvinist problem and how, you know, the relation to capitalism and how can you tell if you're saved or not? And I actually do think this is a valid question. I think it's a question that people are implicitly asking themselves all the time. Like, can I find any symbol or sign to know if I have, you know, that I am somehow saved? And, you know, and I think this is a sort of secretly or in an obscure way behind a lot of the kind of, you know, performance of a certain kind of politics. You know, I'm a good person because I think this, and, you know, these are bad people because they disagree with me, which is very Manichaean, which is, you know, we could see is very dualistic, and not sort of dialectical in a you know, in a Marxist or even a Christian way. So I think that tendency that, you know, or even in Plato we could see it with the gold, silver, and bronze, you know, types of people or whatever. I think, you know, democracy and ideas of equality that cohere or adhere to a certain democratic model emphasize the universalist aspect of Christianity in a way, like everyone being equal before God. And so the democratic model is that of a certain kind of equality. in relation to the state, which obviously would strongly oppose any form of differentiation of human types, right? Whether it's Gnostic or philosophical or religious or whatever. It seems profoundly unfair to say that some people are preemptively not saved, or that they can't escape, or something like this. And I suppose it's interesting that as Bataille recognizes that it's not really in the Christian sense about deeds, right? So the idea that if you live a good life and you go to church, and this will in belief, and that question of what belief actually is very complicated, but that will guarantee that you are saved, that it's not like that, that actually if the Gnostics thought that they already had this kind of spark, then what would it matter if they engaged in like debased or debauched forms of behavior? And in fact, it might actually be a kind of experiential form of transcendence, whether it's ascetic or whether it's excessive in the other direction. So sorry, yeah, that was one part of your question. What was the second part?
I was trying to tie that together with the more general model that comes out of certain strands of Valentinian Gnosticism, whereby the original pleroma is formed by the monad as a single godhead of some kind, and then it disperses through the aeons, and there are various versions of it that becomes Heil, but it's something intrinsic to the pleroma in itself. There is a process, within it, a kind of cosmic algorithm, whereby the pleromatic light becomes matter, and then gradually some of the matter eases itself back into light. So it's about a play between light and matter. It's an extraordinarily powerful metaphysical symbol, but they relate that to this division amongst people, which is a kind of nihilism, and it can easily lead to a kind of hedonistic nihilism or aesthetic nihilism, I guess. And I've been puzzled for a long time about what the connection between these two things can be, but it's reminiscent of certain kinds of visions of existence as simulation or game.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
We might be in that position, yeah.
And I kind of deliberately avoided talking about the Matrix, but Philip K. Dick would be an obvious kind of reference point here, and the various theories that we are living in a computer simulation and so on, like these exist, they are around, they do seem like neo-Gnosticism. I think the nihilism point is the one that Couliano makes, where he says that in a way modern nihilism is Gnosticism without hope. It's the dark side of Gnosticism without the possibility of the initiatic escape or ever gaining any knowledge in that sense. So I think yes, I don't know. I mean, I wonder if we actually live in an era in which matter, it's not clear how people feel about matter, I would say. Like it's often quite hard to talk about nature. People don't like talking about nature as if you're referring to something real. And I think the question of the body has become more and more abstracted and fragmented and fractured, and that there is a lot of kind of hatred for the body as a form of matter, which isn't understood well enough in the terms that we're talking about now as a tendency. So in a way, I suppose, like any good rationalist, I would like to always understand and explain why people think certain things, or what they think, and what thoughts that are similar have come before. So in that sense, I think that Gnosticism could be useful as a way of, as long as it's not too broad, which is John Appleby's point, that again with materialism and the problem is they start to seem like a description for everything, and I think we have to be clear as what the parallels are and what there aren't, I guess.
I mean, I suppose that to the last thing, it poses a question of agency within this system.
Yeah.
In a Gnostic system, how much agency do we have? Because pneumatics have agency, whereas nobody else does. I mean, that's a very severe class distinction, of the ontological distinction in a way. But even in the broader senses of Gnosticism, to immanentize the eschaton, is this something that we can choose to do? Or is it something that is part of the system?
Well, I think that Berglund suggests that it's a kind of utopian fantasy that is ultimately very destructive. So that every time anyone tries to do it, whether they're left or right, or religious or non-religious, it's disastrous. That actually trying to bring about heaven on earth is guarantees that you create hell instead.
Is he right though? Is he right?
I
Berglund.
I think he's too generalizing, but I think he's onto something.
Yeah, I tend to agree.
Yeah.
I just saw a hand raised. Martin Rosenberg.
I just wanted to respond to Charlie and Nina. Hi, Charlie. It seems that Vogelin must be taken with a grain of salt because his ideological position here is pretty easily defined and identified. And I keep on pointing to the fact that Gnosticism may be, as Denise Johns wants to point to, that it's reactive as critique, but there's also this sense that there's an imminent ontotheological ground. It's just that the ground is not transcendent. It's if we listen to ourselves, we can see a lot of this in Spinoza. And I think Spinoza's careful distinction of the relationship between substance, modes, and attributes, and the fact that he read Luria really carefully, and that Luria refers to, for example, Tikkun Olam as both a universal process and an individual choice, suggests that this is already well conceptualized within the heterogeneic nature of Gnosticism itself, and had been from the beginning, if one could say so, such a silly notion. So I'm wondering, has Spinoza fit into this at all for you, for either Charlie or Nina?
I stop. Marty, hi Marty. Yeah, I can see there are a lot of ways in which Spinoza fits into it. I mean, you know, he's not, he doesn't have parity with Vogelin. Vogelin is slightly questionable in some of his politics, undoubtedly.
I mean, his onto-theological position is pretty clear.
Yeah, I mean, but there are other thinkers. I mean, in the sophist, in the Gnostic tradition, the more existentialist version of someone like Boltzmann or maybe Kurt Rudolph, may be possible to align that with a certain kind of monism that Spinoza suggested. But I don't know, Nina's probably got more to say on this than I have.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously, it's kind of face value. Spinoza would seem, you know, opposed to a kind of Gnosticism that would make dualistic separations. I mean, the attributes are different ways of looking at the same thing. And I think the kind of immanent quality of God or nature would seem to put Spinoza on the side of I don't know, I suppose knowledge as kind of is a kind of ethical practice. You know, the more you understand the mind of God, the more you understand how you're determined, which is the only freedom you have within, you know, causation, and that going for a walk in a forest is like going to church because you're in God, you are God. I mean, I love Spinoza, obviously, and I don't know is the answer. I think that I mean, obviously Spinoza is a heretic, but he's a different kind of heretic than the Gnostics. I think, but it's interesting. I don't know about Spinoza reading Luria, and I mean, I'm sure you would know more about that connection. I think maybe there is an exoteric and an esoteric Spinoza. Let's say.
I think that's a very smart way to formulate it. really hilarious, actually. So
that's my answer.
Okay. I think last chance for comments or questions. And if not, we can just, say thank you, Nina, for lively discussion and talk.
Yeah, no worries. And thanks everybody for coming and for your comments and questions.
great talk, Nina.
And the invitation.
Thanks.